In 1932, a farmer named Harold Briggs in rural Nebraska made a decision that most of his neighbors thought was absolute madness. He had $14 left, $14, between his family and starvation. His bank had failed, his crops had failed 2 years in a row, and instead of spending that money on food or seed for the next season, he used it to buy something no one around him could understand. A broken-down used printing press from a man going out of business 3 counties over. His wife thought he had lost his mind. His brother-in-law stopped speaking to him for 6 months. But by 1941, Harold Briggs owned the most successful regional newspaper in 3 states, employed 47 people, and had enough in savings to help 6 neighboring families buy back their foreclosed farms. The decision that looked like desperation turned out to be the seed of something no one could have predicted. And Harold was not the only one. Across the United States, between 1929 and 1939, millions of ordinary people made desperate choices under impossible pressure, and some of those choices quietly changed the course of American history, industry, science, and culture in ways that took decades to fully understand. Stay with me until the end of this video, because number 1 on our list is going to completely change the way you think about failure. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we find these stories every week and you don't want to miss what's coming. Number 20 is where we begin. Number 20. In 1930, thousands of urban families gave up their apartments and moved back to rural areas to try farming, something most of them had never done in their lives. City workers who had spent decades in factories and offices suddenly found themselves trying to grow food on small plots of land their relatives had abandoned years before. Most of them failed at farming in ways that would be almost comical if the circumstances weren't so desperate. They planted wrong, irrigated wrong, harvested wrong. But the unexpected result came a generation later. Their children, raised with 1 foot in the rural world and 1 foot in the urban mindset, became some of the most innovative agricultural scientists, food entrepreneurs, and rural development experts of the mid-20th century. The cross-pollination of industrial thinking and farming tradition produced by that forced migration quietly transformed American agriculture in the 1950s and 60s in ways nobody planned. Number 19. Women across the country began making their own clothing out of flour sacks and feed bags. Manufacturers had no idea this was happening at first, but when they found out, when they started seeing women bringing in flour sacks to compare patterns and colors before buying, they made a business decision that changed the textile industry forever. They started printing their cotton flour sacks in beautiful floral and checkered patterns, so women would buy their brand specifically for the fabric. What started as desperate necessity became a multi-decade marketing revolution. By the late 1930s, fabric quality and print design had become a major competitive factor in the commodity food industry, a connection that had never existed before, and that reshaped how brands thought about packaging for the rest of the century. Number 18. During the worst years of the Depression, many American families stopped using doctors entirely because they simply could not afford it. This forced a massive revival of home medical knowledge, old herbal remedies, grandmother's treatments, neighbor-to-neighbor healing traditions that had nearly disappeared in the urban industrial age. The unexpected result? A generation of Americans grew up with an unusually deep practical knowledge of the human body, nutrition, and natural medicine. Several of the pioneers of the American health food movement, alternative medicine, and nutritional science of the 1960s and 70s have traced their origins directly to childhood spent watching their mothers and grandmothers treat illnesses at home with plants, fermented foods, and careful observation. Desperation preserved a body of folk medical knowledge that would otherwise have been lost entirely. If you've ever thought about what knowledge your family carries that the world doesn't know exists, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your story. Number 17. Municipalities across the country, unable to pay their workers in cash, began issuing scrip, local currency that could only be spent within the community. This was seen at the time as a humiliation, a sign of total economic collapse. But the unexpected result was that these scrip economies revealed something profound about how money actually works at the local level. Economists who studied the scrip systems of the 1930s produced some of the most important foundational research in what would later become the field of behavioral economics and community currency theory. The ideas generated by studying Depression-era script influenced monetary policy discussions decades later and directly informed experiments in alternative currencies and local exchange systems in the 1970s and 80s. Number 16. Thousands of Americans defaulted on their mortgages and abandoned houses they had spent their entire lives paying for. This was devastating on every human level, but it created an unexpected housing laboratory. Architects, urban planners, and government housing officials were suddenly confronted with entire neighborhoods of empty homes, and they had an unprecedented opportunity to study what worked and what didn't in American residential design. The research and observation done during the foreclosure crisis of the 1930s directly influenced the design standards used in the massive post-World War II housing boom. The suburban neighborhoods of the 1950s were shaped in large part by lessons learned from the emptied houses of the Depression. Number 15. Young men who could find no work in cities began riding freight trains across the country, becoming what the press called hobos or tramps. Roughly 250 teenagers alone were estimated to be riding the rails by 1932. This vast, involuntary migration did something completely unplanned. It created a generation of Americans with unusually broad geographic and cultural knowledge. Young men from Alabama knew what California farming looked like. Boys from Wisconsin had worked beside Mexican immigrants in Texas. The unexpected result was a generation with a nationalized identity, at a time when most Americans had barely left their home counties. Several historians have argued that this wandering generation produced the cultural openness that made the great social movements of the 1940s and 50s possible. Number 14. Hollywood studios, desperate for audiences willing to spend their last dimes, made a decision to invest heavily in pure escapist entertainment, musicals, comedies, and fantasy pictures that had no connection to the grim reality of daily life. The calculated gamble paid off commercially, but the unexpected long-term result was the creation of the golden age of American film. The financial pressure to entertain at all costs pushed writers, directors, and performers to levels of craft and invention they might never have reached in comfortable times. Citizen Kane, The Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind, Stagecoach. Some of the greatest films ever made came directly out of the creative crucible of Depression-era Hollywood, where failure meant the studio closed and the pressure to produce something extraordinary was absolute. Number 13. Subscribe right now if you haven't yet, because what I'm about to tell you about the decisions made by ordinary families in numbers 12 through 1 goes even deeper than anything we've covered so far. Number 13. Families stopped buying toys and began making them. Wood scraps became dolls and trucks. Tin cans became musical instruments. Fabric remnants became stuffed animals. This had an unexpected generational effect on American creativity and manufacturing. The children who grew up making their own playthings developed an unusually strong intuition for materials, construction, and design. Researchers studying the post-war generation of American engineers and inventors have noted a striking correlation between Depression childhoods and exceptional hands-on problem-solving ability. The toy-making forced on families by poverty may have seeded the inventive culture of the American manufacturing boom of the 1950s and 60s. Number 12. State governments, desperate for revenue without raising income taxes on people who had no income, began legalizing and taxing activities they had previously prohibited. Gambling, horse racing, and, most significantly, alcohol, which had been banned since Prohibition, were all legalized across multiple states in the 1930s specifically as Depression-era revenue measures. The unexpected result was the permanent reshaping of American moral and legal culture around vice and taxation. Many of the legal frameworks governing gambling, alcohol sales, and entertainment that still exist today were written in haste during the 1930s by legislators who simply needed money. Laws meant to be temporary became permanent, and the industries built around them became political forces powerful enough to ensure they stayed that way. Number 11. Farmers who could no longer afford chemical fertilizers reverted to composting, crop rotation, and traditional soil management practices that had largely been abandoned in the early industrial era. At the time, this was seen as going backward, a failure of modernization. But the unexpected result was the preservation and documentation of agricultural techniques that would become the foundation of the organic farming movement 60 years later. The knowledge that industrial agriculture was pushing out of practice was accidentally preserved by the poverty of the 1930s. Several of the foundational figures of American organic and sustainable agriculture have spoken about learning their core practices from grandparents or parents who only kept those old methods because they couldn't afford anything else. Number 10. Small-town banks that survived the initial crash made a desperate decision to lend money to businesses and individuals that larger banks would never have touched, not out of generosity, but because those were the only loans available to make. They extended credit to Black-owned businesses in the South, to women entrepreneurs, and to recent immigrants in ways that the formal banking establishment of the era explicitly refused to do. The unexpected result was a quiet diversification of American small business ownership in the 1930s that laid the groundwork for economic communities that would become significant political and cultural forces by the 1960s. Necessity broke down barriers that ideology had kept firmly in place. Number 9. The federal government, desperate to put men to work and to justify the enormous cost of the New Deal programs, commissioned an unprecedented documentation of American culture. The Federal Writers Project, the Federal Art Project, and the Federal Theater Project employed thousands of artists, writers, and performers, and directed them to document, record, and perform American folk life, history, and culture. The unexpected result was the creation of the most comprehensive archive of American vernacular culture ever assembled. The oral histories collected in the 1930s, the folk songs recorded by the Library of Congress, the murals painted in post offices across the country. These artifacts have been used by historians, artists, and educators ever since, and they document a way of American life that was already disappearing and would have been lost entirely without the desperate funding of the New Deal. Think about what else might have been lost. Think about what's being lost right now that nobody is recording. Leave a comment if you think about that. Number 8. Middle-class families that lost their savings stopped sending their children to private schools and colleges and enrolled them instead in the rapidly expanding public university system. At the time, this felt like a step down, a failure, a concession to poverty. The unexpected result was an enormous influx of talented, motivated students into public higher education institutions that had previously been considered second-rate. The intellectual quality of state universities increased dramatically during the 1930s simply because the Depression democratized who attended them. Many of the great scientists, writers, and thinkers who shaped American intellectual life in the mid-20th century were the children of families that lost their money in the crash and ended up at public universities they would never have considered in better times. Number 7. Desperate families began growing their own food in vacant lots, backyards, and any available urban space, what people at the time called relief gardens or subsistence gardens. By 1934, there were an estimated 2.5 million such gardens across the United States. Leave a comment if your own grandparents or great-grandparents had a garden like this. I want to know how many of our families were touched by this. The unexpected result of all this desperate urban gardening was the creation of an American gardening culture that had never existed before. Seed companies, gardening tool manufacturers, and horticultural educators all expanded dramatically to serve the new gardeners of the Depression. The gardening infrastructure built in the 1930s provided the foundation for the home gardening boom of every subsequent decade and planted seeds, literally and culturally, that are still growing today. Number 6. Automobile manufacturers, seeing sales collapse to almost nothing, made the counterintuitive decision to use the Depression as an opportunity to redesign their products from the ground up, rather than simply shutting down production. Engineers who would normally have been managing production lines were suddenly freed to experiment and innovate. The result was a burst of automotive engineering progress in the mid-1930s that produced some of the most advanced vehicle designs in history. The streamlined, all-steel body designs developed during the Depression years became the foundation of American automobile design for the next 2 decades and set the aesthetic and engineering standards that defined American car culture at its peak. Number 5. Amateur radio operators, hobbyists who had been broadcasting and receiving signals as a pastime throughout the 1920s, found themselves suddenly playing a critical role in Depression-era America because local government and emergency services couldn't afford reliable communication infrastructure. Out of financial desperation, emergency coordinators began formalizing relationships with amateur operators, creating protocols and networks that had never existed before. The unexpected result was the creation of the Organized Amateur Radio Emergency Communication System that would prove absolutely critical during World War II, and that still exists today as the backbone of disaster communication infrastructure. What started as desperate cost-cutting became a permanent institution that has saved countless lives. Number 4. Writers, artists, and musicians who could find no paying audience for their work made the desperate decision to perform, exhibit, and publish for free. In parks, in churches, in union halls, anywhere people would gather. This forced a profound reconnection between American art and ordinary American life. The unexpected result was a generation of artists and writers whose work was shaped by direct, sustained contact with working class and poor communities in ways that produced some of the most powerful American art of the 20th century. John Steinbeck, Dorothea Lange, Woody Guthrie, the artists who defined the American conscience of the Depression era, made the work they made because poverty forced them to live and work alongside the people they were documenting. The art that came out of that necessity has endured because it was real in a way that comfortable art rarely manages to be. Number 3. Insurance companies that survived the Depression made a desperate decision to expand their product lines and aggressively market new forms of coverage. Health insurance, unemployment insurance, and life insurance products. To a population that had just learned, the hard way, how quickly everything could disappear. Before the Depression, insurance was considered primarily a luxury for the wealthy. The unexpected result of the Depression-era insurance marketing push was the permanent transformation of American attitudes toward financial protection and risk management. The insurance culture that developed in the 1930s and 40s laid the psychological and institutional groundwork for the Social Security system, the employer-sponsored benefits packages of the post-war era, and ultimately the entire modern American system of financial protection that today covers virtually every citizen from birth. Number 2. Universities and research institutions that lost their private funding scrambled desperately to find government and military contracts to keep their laboratories running and their scientists employed. This forced marriage between academic research and government funding, which many scientists at the time resisted and resented as a compromise of scientific independence, produced an unexpected institutional infrastructure that would prove transformative. The federal funding relationships and research networks built during the Depression were the same networks mobilized to develop radar, penicillin, and ultimately nuclear technology during World War II. Without the desperate financial scrambling of Depression-era universities, the scientific capacity that won the war might not have existed. And the institutional model, government-funded academic research, became the template for the most productive scientific era in human history, producing the discoveries that define modern medicine, computing, and physics. And now, number 1. The decision that I believe is the most important and the most misunderstood of everything the Depression produced. In 1931 and 1932, as the economic collapse deepened and desperation reached levels that are almost impossible for us to imagine today, thousands of ordinary Americans made a quiet, almost invisible decision. They stayed. When they could have left, when banks were failing, when crops were gone, when neighbors were loading wagons and heading somewhere, anywhere that might be better. They stayed in their communities. They stayed not because things were good, things were catastrophic. They stayed because they made a calculation, conscious or not, that their connections to other people, to neighbors, to local institutions, to the familiar web of relationships that made daily survival possible, were worth more than the uncertain promise of something better somewhere else. And what happened as a result was extraordinary. The communities where people stayed and worked together developed social bonds, mutual aid networks, and cooperative institutions during the Depression that gave those same communities extraordinary resilience for the next 50 years. Sociologists who have studied Depression-era community survival have found a consistent pattern. The places that came through the 1930s with their social fabric intact produced stronger civic institutions, higher rates of economic mobility, and greater political engagement for decades afterward. The desperate decision to stay, to trust that the people around you were worth trusting, turned out to be one of the most productive investments anyone could have made. Not because it felt right, not because there was any evidence it would work, but because connection, human connection, community, the decision to be part of something larger than your own survival, has always been the deepest source of resilience any person or any community has ever found. That is what the Great Depression taught the people who lived through it, and it is the lesson that every generation since has had to learn again for itself. And that is the question I want to leave you with today. If you had been there, if you had $14 left and a family to feed and everything falling apart around you, what would you have done? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this video made you think differently about difficulty in decision-making, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.